next year.
I didn't know that.
They haven't set a date yet. Okay. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started on time here. Welcome to the May meeting of the Taos Archaeological Society. Good to see everybody get outside. It's a nice, beautiful day today. And we are going to be pretty busy this summer, really. We have that Folsom trip, which was actually sold out in June. And then we will have a potluck August 6th, and that is going to be at Stan and Christian Rivelis's house. So you'll be seeing a map for that. That's a Sunday. And then the following Monday is Seb Foles. Dr. Foles is going to be here. We don't usually do a talk in August, but we will because he's going to be in town. And he'll be talking about Picaries, their projects up there the last couple of years with the University of Arizona, graduate students, cooperating with the Picaries, doing excavation and survey of some agricultural terracing, and they're finding some new things up there. So that'll be at the regular time, 7 o'clock, August 7th. So 7 at 7. And then September, we'll have other speakers coming. Just keep an eye out on the website for that. That's the best place to look at. I send emails about the talks, but that's the best place really to look for the talk coming up. And anyone can access that. So taosarc.org, and you'll see what's going on. And then I mentioned Paul Reed. I think he's got sick for that Chaco Canyon trip, but so he can take up to 12, and they'll go May 12th and 15th. So tonight, we have Cassandra Keys, who is the assistant archaeologist for Carson National Forest, and also the vice president of Taos Archaeological Society, mother of two. And so we're real happy to have her here. She's real busy all the time joining the club. So without further ado, we'll just turn it over to her. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. As Phil mentioned, I'm Cassandra Keys. I'm currently the assistant forest archaeologist on the Carson National Forest. Yeah. What about now? The microphone's not working. Is it working now?
We're getting real close to it, and then maybe
Oh,
you
I got
can.
it around.
Well, maybe it just needs to be raised up or put closer to the other or something.
Go ahead and try it again. Okay.
Hello.
No, it's not working.
Maybe I got him.
I mean, I could try to talk a little bit louder.
It is a small
Does
room.
that work? Yeah. Okay.
Just don't move around a lot.
Okay.
Well, you can pantomime a little.
Few minutes, let my heart rate come down. Okay, so in this role, I'm pretty new to the Carson still. I just have been on for a little bit over a year now. So this whole idea of fire archaeology and the concept of managing cultural resources during a fire incident was completely new to me before I came on. And but this last summer, just a few months in on the role, I was able to do a couple of assignments on the Hermit's Peak Canyon fire. And I also later in the fall went into an assignment in California. And so I don't know, this just the idea that cultural resources are still taken into consideration during, something like a wildfire. Was really interesting to me, and so I'm just really excited to share with you guys some of that, how that process works, and some of the things that we do to protect cultural resources during an emergency. So in terms of the presentation, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what fire archaeology is, and what some of the roles archaeologists have during a wildfire incident. We're going to talk a little bit about the Section 106 process and how the 106 process looks on the day-to-day, the standard process versus the 106 process during an emergency. We'll talk a little bit about some of the resources that are brought on to help do some of this resource management. We'll talk a little bit about some of the actions that are taken during the wildfire response, including the suppression repair, and burned area emergency response. And then lastly, the exciting part, I'm going to share with you guys some of the sites that we found during the Hermit's Peak Canyon fire. These are all previously unknown sites, and so I'll kind of talk about how we found them as they relate to some of those wildfire response activities. And so this is going to be just like a really cursory overview. I'm not going to go into super detail about anything. So if you guys do have questions or something is kind of unclear, I'm fine with you asking questions during the presentation. But if you want to wait till the end, or we'll have a moment of pause in there where we can have some questions. So what is fire archaeology? To me, fire archaeology can be a few different things. I sometimes think of it as archaeologists who study the effects that fire has on the archaeological record. So Phil and I were just talking about studying the effects fire has on like lithics and on ceramics. But fire archaeology can also be the study of the past practices of using fire, so it's like indigenous burning or cultural burning. But generally, when we refer to fire archaeology, and definitely in terms of this presentation, it refers to when archaeologists respond to a wildfire incident to gather information about the presence of cultural resources and to help figure out how best to protect them. And so this really is something that cultural resource management specialists like myself do every day, but the process is a little bit different, as we'll see. And so the role of an archaeologist on a fire incident specifically, one is to identify and protect cultural resources from the fire itself, but also some of the activities that are associated with controlling the fire. Fire archaeologists also advise and provide input to the incident management teams. And the incident management teams are the group of folks, fire personnel, who are brought on to kind of manage the overall fire in terms of organization and logistics, and make sure everything kind of runs smoothly. Fire archaeologists can also work with fire crews on the fire line, and they can also conduct post-fire assessments. So after the fire has come through, we can go in to look and see what some of the effects that fire had on the archaeology. Also, I think to clarify, the term cultural resources can mean a few different things. So we're all, you guys are all familiar with archaeology, so you understand what that means. But cultural resources are not just archaeology, which is the physical remains of past human activity, and which can be historic or prehistoric. But cultural resources can also be ethnographic resources. And so these can be objects or landscapes that have a cultural significance to a traditionally associated group. So think of traditional cultural properties or just traditional use areas. And cultural resources can also be historic resources, which are essentially historic properties that retain some of their original function, so bridges or some buildings, acequias. Those would be some historic properties, and those are everything that we consider to be a cultural resource. So this process of gathering information about the presence of cultural resources and figuring out how best to protect them is part of what we refer to as the Section 106 process. And so Section 106 really is a set of regulations within the National Historic Preservation Act that requires federal agencies to take into consideration the effect that a proposed project or a specific project or an undertaking may have on cultural resources, and how best to minimize or avoid adversely affecting those resources. And so when I say undertaking, An undertaking in terms of the section 106 process is basically anything, any activity that takes place on federal land, uses federal dollars or requires a federal permit to do. And so basically, everything that we do on the Forest Service is an undertaking and is subject to this 106 process where we work with other shops within the agency, like timber and fuels, to kind of identify project areas. They let us know what they're going to be doing, where they're going to be doing it. And then as archaeologists, we go in, we do a literature review. And then we'll go in and survey or do a cultural resource inventory of that project area. And this step really can take anywhere from an afternoon, if you're just going to look at where they might be putting in a cattle guard, to taking months to complete if you're looking at landscape scale restoration projects, like we're having on course now. But as part of that, we go through and we'll inventory and look for sites, and then we have to document all of those sites. So as you can imagine, this process can take a very long time. Once we get all that information from the field, we have to bring it back to the office. We have to write a report, and then we submit that report to the State Historic Preservation Office for review and comment. So depending on the nature and the scale of the project, this process can really take months to years of planning. So this is the process that we would go through for projects like prescribed fires, where we'll work with the fuel shop to go in and like inventory the area where they want to do kind of prescribed burning. And then once we find cultural resources, we work with them, and all cultural sites, when we have the time, are protected and treated according to a predetermined protocols. And so when we have those sites, we do our best to minimize any kind of adverse effect that that project may have on those sites. And so sometimes we will allow burning, like a low intensity burning through sites, especially if they're just like lithic scatters and that it's not going to have a huge impact. Those sites have probably been burned several times over, through the years. But we wouldn't allow any kind of pile burning within those site boundaries, which is where you see the big piles of fuel and they ignite those. And we also don't allow any heavy equipment within site boundaries just because of the potential for that to disturb the ground and impact resources. Fuels in these kinds of sites are often removed by hand. So we'll go in with chainsaws and kind of remove some of that stuff, and it gets carried out of the site instead of using heavy equipment to masticate something. And then in general, fire sensitive sites are avoided. So cabins for things that can burn easily, we will avoid altogether, though they may also have some of the fuels removed by hand. So this process is a little bit different when it comes to a wildfire, and especially when a wildfire is declared an emergency, just because of the time and the intensity of things, I guess. So we refer to this emergency declaration as 812, and it's a kind of a different set of regulations, also within the National Historic Preservation Act. But it doesn't just apply to wildfires either. It's kind of any natural disaster. It can be flooding, earthquakes, tornadoes. But basically how it works is somewhat complicated. So I'm not going to go into the details. But at the simplest level, the way that it works is because everything that takes place on the forest during a wildfire is considered to be an undertaking. It is subject to the 106 process. But what the 812 regulations do is they allow for a more abbreviated and more flexible version of that process. Sometimes it could be the case that we do section 106 after some of these activities have been implemented instead of that long drawn out process beforehand. So basically, the long and short of it is that life and property comes first. But even in the midst of a crisis, agencies are still responsible for protecting cultural resources and mitigating adverse effects to those resources. And so I kind of like to think of it as section 106 on the fly. It's a little bit different. It can move so fast. But one of the essential things is because these agencies still have these legal responsibilities for resource protection, there are a special group of people who they bring onto these fire incidents and emergency incidents in general to help manage some of those resources. And so it's really a cohort of people, and they come from across the country, and they come from across agencies. And they are generally referred to as resource advisors. And we basically do that. We advise on resource protection during a fire. One of the things, so there's a whole big training that you have to go through in order to be a resource advisor. But not all resource advisors can be archaeologists, though all archaeologists can be resource advisors if they want. So in order to be an archaeologist, you have to have a background in archaeology and basically do that as your day job. But like I'm also a read, and so if we want to get on a fire assignment and they actually need me to go look at like a spring that was impacted, or to help with erosion control or something, then I can do that as well. So I prefer the archaeology part of it. They also might bring on cultural specialists, and these are people who deal specifically with like the tribal aspect of things. So they might deal more closely with our tribal partners in terms of tribal consultation and really communicating with them. So these resources, the reeds, the arcs, and the cultural specialists are needed for all stages of wildfire response. And so some of the actions that are included in this wildfire response are suppression, which is really the initial stages of controlling the fire. Suppression repair is basically that, it's repairing some of those suppression activities. And we'll go into more detail on all these, so you can see what they look like. And then there's the burned area emergency response, which technically happens at the tail end of a fire. And, but it can, like the Hermit's Peak Canyon fire, when fires are so big, you might have some of these activities happening simultaneously, where the fire has already burned. Like in the Santa Fe, you have the Bear people going out there and doing assessments, whereas some of us still up here north, we're working on the suppression activities. So suppression, like I said, is the initial stages of the wildfire response. And it can involve a variety of activities that have the potential to impact cultural resources, traditional use areas, and sacred sites. So for example, we have dozer line, where they'll try to create a fuel break using bulldozers. And so this example here, you can see it has the potential, I mean, it's a lot of ground disturbance that's happening. And this line in particular is probably only about 2 blades wide. Some of the fires in California can be up to like 8 blades wide. So you can see how that can really have the potential to disturb a lot of ground in terms of natural resources. We have hand line, so obviously not as destructive as dozer line, just because it's smaller in scale, but because it does still disturb the ground, it has the potential to affect. And so this is when archaeologists and resource advisors might work directly with these hand crews on the fire line to kind of help direct them and make them aware of the cultural resources that are present. And hand line is actually really beneficial in some instances, especially if it's used around the site to prevent the fire from coming. So even on the forest now, to like during this regular section 106 process too, will part of our treatments are to put a hand line around the site so that as the fire kind of creeps along the ground, when it gets to that bare earth, it doesn't have any more fuel to burn, so it doesn't burn the site. Then we have retardant or water drops even, but retardant can be particularly impactful, not just to cultural resources, but natural resources as well, especially if it's dropped anywhere near water. But what it happens is that it can have the potential because it can be kind of heavy, it can crack some features maybe, but it really is just like this slurry that kind of leaves a film that can contaminate sites, and especially areas of traditional use. Another example of some suppression stuff is these safety zones or fire camps. So when these when people respond to a fire incident, there's not always a place for them to stay. When I went on the Hermit's Peak Canyon, we were just in the Penasco Middle School. So it was just there in the parking lot, but sometimes they have to construct zones for people to stay. And that entails removing all of that fuel so that it's a safe place for people to be. But so we have to consider the impacts that this is gonna have, not just in terms of clearing that vegetation off, but the impacts that vehicles are going to have, that, all the foot traffic is gonna have, people are setting up tents, and there's just a lot of movement happening. So really it's essential, and that's just a small list. There's all kinds of things that can happen, but yeah, anyway, so it's really important for, as resource advisors and archaeologists, to work closely with these fire management teams and the heavy machine operators. Because we really need to know, ideally ahead of time, when and where and how some of these suppression activities are going to take place. So we can work ahead of them. And we also have to work really closely with the local agencies. And this is specifically in terms of archaeology to know where sites are. So we want that data from them so that we can get ahead of some of these suppression activities and either redirect the dozer line or go out and do what we can to protect that resource. And then also working with the agency to see, because not all of the people in the Forest Service and the BLM have the same idea of how they want to treat sites or how they want to manage them. And so really it's just communicating with them. And we have to work really closely also with the tribal partners. So because a lot of times we need information from them that's not on a map. So a lot of times their sacred sites or traditional use areas are not going to be something that we have spatial data for. So it's really essential to communicate with them and understand where those resources might be and how they want us to handle suppression activities in those areas. So when it comes to suppression, it's really ideal to work ahead of the ground disturbing activities or the fire itself. And so this really entails communicating a lot with division and task force. And the division, so I mentioned the incident management team, and they're kind of responsible for the whole fire, but then how the fire gets broken down depending on how big it is, all the different divisions. So I don't know if you guys followed the Hermit's Peak, Cap Canyon, and when they talk like Division Alpha, Division Zulu, Division Foxtrot. So those are all managed by one person. And then the task force is just a smaller unit within that division as well. And so we work really closely with them. Communicating because they're the ones who have the information about what the fire is going to do and where they want to put in containment lines. And so if we can get ahead, that's better. So we walk the proposed dozer lines, and this is nice to do because when we walk the dozer line ahead of time, especially when we have the spatial data from the agencies, we can flag known sites. And so all resources, sensitive resources during the fire, are flagged with some sort of flagging, and this can vary, but it's one type of flagging, and so everyone on the whole fire knows that that's a sensitive resource. And it can be anything from white flagging to stripe flagging, pink, blue. Well, not pink generally is a hazard tree, but so we'll flag known sites so that if we're ahead of the dozer line when they get there, they know that they're in a sensitive area. And if they have their blade on the ground, they can lift their blade to minimize some of that damage that's going to happen. We'll go through, and if we find new sites, kind of same thing, except we'll document it. We'll take a point on it, and we'll flag it. So the same thing. If we're working ahead of the fire, we can do structure protection. And so basically these two pictures you see on the right here are structures that were wrapped in basically glorified tinfoil. It's structure protection wrap. And as long as the fire is not too intense, that will protect that structure from being burned in case the fire comes. In this bottom right-hand photo, it was really cool during when, I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, but when those fires were encroaching in California into the giant sequoia groves. So they had resource advisors out there wrapping the structure wrap around the base of the giant sequoias so that if the fire came on, they wouldn't be burned up. Pretty cool. And generally we just are out there collecting a lot of data. One thing in terms of cultural resource data, that's all sensitive, very sensitive information. We consider it confidential. So it's not that spatial data doesn't get presented to the rest of the fire. So we kind of have to work. This is flagging is another way to just kind of communicate with everybody that's a sensitive area and needs to be protected without them specifically knowing that it's an archaeological site. But sometimes we have to walk the line after suppression activities have been implemented. And this is generally just because there's a lack of personnel who might not have the resources to go out there and walk it ahead of time. You kind of have to do triage when you're out there, what's more important. And sometimes it could be just because it's not safe to be walking in front of the dozer line. Sometimes they do night operations. Obviously, it's not going to do us any good to walk a dozer line at night time, not seeing anything. But then also if there's really active fire by, we won't be walking ahead of the dozer line. But this usually involves some of the same site protection measures. We'll document it and we'll flag it. And sometimes more documentation might be necessary if we have to do a damage assessment form afterwards. And the reason we flag it even afterwards is because during the suppression repair phase, they still need to know when, or where the sensitive resources that are in the area. Okay, so once the fire has been controlled, all that line, that doze line, hand line, fences sometimes get destroyed. All of that needs to be cleared up and the area needs to be repaired. So like in this photo before, you can see that probably was an existing road. Then they just created a bigger fuel break. And so all that stuff there on the right, they'll have to pull that back over to kind of repair that back to more or less a road. So again, here, it really involves the same level of communication with fire personnel, with the local agencies, and with our tribal partners. And then what the goal is to repair the land and to the site back to as close as we can to the original state before the suppression happens. Though sometimes it is better to leave a site unrepaired. And this, like an example of that might be if a dozer line went through a stone circle site, it might cause more damage to try to put that back together. And we certainly aren't going to be able to, put those rocks that were removed back into their original location. So what we do in those instances is just really document. We'll see. I'll show you some of what that documentation looks like, but that's really the most important thing we can do, and it's how we mitigate those adverse effects in terms of how that relates to the 106 process. I guess if we couldn't get there ahead of time, the only thing that we can do afterwards is photograph and take notes and stuff. But suppression repair really is designed to minimize future impacts that might occur in the area, such as erosion. We don't want people out there driving on unauthorized roads. Sometimes when you clear an area, it opens the site up, and people might want to come and loot it. So that's just the name of the one thing for specifically with archaeology is to, in terms of mitigation, we'll go out there and we'll monitor what they're doing. And so when we're out there taking our notes on things, we'll let the fire people know, like when it comes to site, like if this site needs to be repaired, if it needs monitored, if you need a hand crew to repair it, or if no action is necessary. But more common is just monitoring. And it really just involves working closely with these heavy equipment operators and hand crews and kind of directing them where to go, and what they can and can't do. And surprisingly, those excavator barrels, the term right now, they can be quite delicate. I've worked with them to repair some of those burns. They can lightly tap it and make it so pretty close to what was there before. So as I mentioned, sometimes, especially in terms of 106, we don't have all this time to go out there and plan and prepare and protect these sites the way that we want to. So one way that we mitigate that is just through documentation. Document, just is the most important thing you can do. So some of that documentation includes collecting the spatial data and giving, knowing where the sites are located, where repair points are, where features are located. We take a ton of notes. As archaeologists, if you have a lead arc on the fire, they're going to require you to have a daily log where you write down basically everything that happens between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. And then if a site was damaged, you are going to have to do a damage assessment form. Taking a ton of photographs, and I like to photograph everything. More pictures the better. We sometimes will do sketch maps. And that just kind of gives you a better idea of where some of these activities or these impacts may have happened in relation to other stuff going on at the site. And really the point of taking such detailed notes is because all of this information will eventually go to the local agency so that they can complete their 106 process. And so a lot of times the archaeologists who come on a fire, they can be coming from all over the country. And so it's not necessarily the agency archaeologists who are out there doing some of this work. So you really want to give them the best information that you can so they can write a report and send that report to the State Historic Preservation Office like we would in the normal 106 process. And just real quickly here, this could be a presentation in and of itself. But there is the burned area emergency response, which is basically once it's safe to do so, archaeologists can go to the burn area to assess the fire's impact to archaeological sites specifically. Down here, this is an example of a church lake that was heated to such extremes that it pot lidded. And so that's the kind of things that we'd be looking for. And just the same thing with the repair activity. There's nothing you can do about this. We didn't have time to protect the site, so the only thing we can really do is document it. What was there. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the wildfire response activities? Before we move on?
It does sound really exhausting.
You know, if you're out there, the fire assignment is 14 straight days, 16-hour days. Every day you're doing something, and for the reeds, it's like, people don't understand, it's still like a lot of work for us, like it's not daylight, we're not out there doing something more, but we have to go back to our tents and type up all these notes, right? And find a way to organize all the data that we just collected throughout the day. Okay, well, so now, yeah.
I was wondering, the person who was working, who was standing in, with all the rock pile, what was he looking at?
We don't know what that was, but it, you know, sometimes rock piles can be in the very beginning, this one.
Yeah,
I don't know. We don't know what it was. We even had a tribal person with us, and they kind of, it could be anything from just a cairn marking a trail. It could be a burial. It could be some other.
Could be a mining
It
boundary,
could be a mining boundary, some marker.
mining claim boundary.
But so generally, when we find these on the day-to-day, we'll really try to consult with the tribes and ask for their input, just to see if that might be anything. But we flagged this so people knew that, you know, to avoid, because you can see, you can read it on the right, left-hand side of them, there was all, I mean, like trees, just pile of trees from them putting in the mine. So it was really important to flag that, to make sure that when they pulled all of those trees back over the line to prevent erosion and all that, that they weren't going to be impacting.
I had a question.
Yeah.
What was the bubbled up thing you mentioned? Some church?
Church, it's
Church, oh, it
yeah.
wasn't a piece of a church then.
Oh, no.
No,
It's like Flint.
Yeah, I got you. And then the foil wrap cabin, was that just an outhouse? Was it a recreation cabin?
You know, I don't know what that one in particular was.
Got a stovepipe.
I pulled it off this New York Times article here.
Could
so
be a
it's not-
sauna. In the fire it would be.
You know, one thing that, I mean, they really go, we like protected we structure wrapped a lot of our rec residences here. And I don't know if any of you guys saw, if you were driving down the road, Agua Piedra cabin, the structure wrapped. Be able to do that, but one big thing is like, especially all the old lookout towers, they'll really make an effort to protect those too.
So is this aluminized mylar or is it different than the fire blankets?
I think it might be a little different than fire blankets. It might not have that extra fiberglass in there. The silicone coating. I actually haven't worked with structure wrap, so. Okay, well, now here's the exciting part in my mind, is some of the sites that we found during the Hermit's Peak Canyon fire. To start, we have the Hickory site. And so this site, we actually were able to find ahead of suppression activities. So we were communicating with division and task force and the local agency, and they were anticipating fire behavior to continue going in one direction. So they wanted to put in a line to contain it in the event that it kept going. And so they communicated that with us, and they let us know that we needed to go out there and walk it. So we spent a few days walking that line, and it was nice because it wasn't such a rush. We were actually really able to kind of sit down, look for lots of artifacts, and do a thorough documentation, and really just kind of appreciate some of the stuff that was there. And folks,
And you call that the Hickory site, why?
well,
I'm gonna
because
tell you.
some of the items that we found, to answer Tim's question, included these ceramics down here. And it's kind of the scalloped micaceous ceramics that we felt were indicative of an Apache occupation. They're kind of, so the Pueblo groups used, ceramic, like the micaceous ceramics as well, but I think that this like scalloped rim is pretty indicative from that types. But some of the other artifacts that we found were this interesting piece of brownstone, which was perfectly circular. It was like a ball, so it wasn't like your typical mono that you might see. We also found this really cool, it's a reworked overshot plate. I think that was turned into like a perforator, like a drill of some kind. And then just tons of flakes and ceramic. We found some metal artifacts too. It's kind of hard to say if maybe this is a later Hickory occupation and then if they're related or if it's just kind of something different. But these Hickory sites, the Hickory Apache sites in this part of the Carson are not that. So this is an exciting find for sure. And so here we have our East Zone archaeologist actually working really closely with the task force leader here as the contingency line was coming through on the best ways that we could work with them to avoid going through that. And luckily we were, they could stay on, there was kind of a road that they were going to be following. And luckily this site was off just enough that it wasn't going to be impacted by any of that dozer activity. And then we also worked with these same folks during the repair process. So you can see, at least here was just kind of working ahead of the dozer. We're kind of monitoring what they're doing. And what we were concerned about was all of this material that had gotten pushed up and moved around, that we want to really monitor what they're doing as they put that dirt back over to see if there's going to be anything else like uncovered or any other resources we didn't see. And also just to keep our eyes on them to see, say, whoa, you're going too far this way. You got to stay away from the white flagging kind of thing. But yeah, that's just a really cool site. The next site we have is the Ripley Point site. And this one might actually be one of my favorite sites in Carson now. And it is a high elevation site. I think this one was found at about 11,000 feet. And it's just kind of an example. This one was found following the suppression activities. So one of the archaeologists was walking after, behind the dozer line, after they had put it in. And it was kind of, sometimes, we do find sites, so it's kind of like a blessing and a curse doing the dozer stuff, because I don't know that we would have seen this site beforehand, because if any of those artifacts are buried or there's so much vegetation, you wouldn't see it with them anyway. So now that the dozers come through and it's scraped off that top layer of dirt, the archaeologist who was there was noticing flakes in the dozer line, and she started seeing ceramics in the dozer line, which got everybody really excited because you just don't find ceramics at 11. It's not very common at all. And so then upon further investigations going to the site, we found a mono. We found two monos actually. That was really nice. There was a handful of complete projectile points. Several of them were obsidian. We found this scraper here. I like to call these ones turtleback scrapers. We found a couple of rock features. Not sure, Tim, this one actually reminds me, I think, Aaron, of Turkey Springs, some of those like depressions in the rocks. But could be hunting line. We don't really know. There was, and then here's an example of some of the ceramics, which we were just kind of referring to as punctated. And I reached out to some people who are more familiar with Athabascan, so early Apache kind of affiliation. But he actually thought maybe this ceramics was more closely related or resembles, I guess, ceramics from the Ute. So it could be a plains affiliation. And the way this site is situated, at 11,000 feet, it's really high prominent peak, and you've got the plains to the east and the Taos Plateau to the west, and it just has an incredible view shed. So definitely something special about this. It was really cool. And so when we found it, we worked really closely with the task force, even there, and just really expressing to him that we didn't want any more activity happening in there at all. So no more heavy equipment, and that as best as we could to try to get a command crew in there to do some of that repair. And they were all really, everyone was really cool. We brought lots of people up there, showed them some artifacts, and everyone, in my experience so far, has been super respectful of the archaeology. I was really surprised to go back up there on my second assignment and still see everything exactly. So that was really cool. In terms of repair, the site, I did my first assignment on this one, and everyone was just raging in there, and it was really hard to try to find resources to help repair this. But on my second assignment, towards the end, I think it was like my last day, I worked with Division, and he was awesome and got a big, massive hand crew of like 30 kids up there, and to really work with them to kind of just like cut some of the trees that the dozer had pushed to the side and kind of do what we call lop and scatter, where you just kind of spread it across the site. When we went back up there too, we saw cow tracks Like it was, so those are the kind of things that you want to mitigate, like we covered up, then it's not creating this like easy path for people and animals to walk through. And it is kind of close to is a popular trail. So I wanted to make sure that it was really obscured and it was gonna draw attention that this was now the path where they should go. So you can just kind of see some of the before and after pictures here. This is what the site looks like now. Covered up. Yeah.
Is there water near that site? No.
No. Yeah, it's pretty, I don't know that it's like habitational, doesn't seem like habitational place. One thing I do want to do is, once we haven't processed all this data yet and put all this information into a report, but we really would like to get input from the tribes that we consult with on a regular basis and see what they might have to say. So some of these areas are definitely, significant to them. That's that one. The next one is, we were just calling it the meadow sites. In the found, you can kind of see the meadow back there. But this one was found during suppression repair activity. So this line had been walked beforehand, this line had been walked again, and then we walked it again. And it wasn't until like, I don't know, the several times that we walked over it that we just kind of started seeing artifacts, especially after the rain. So when the fire was originally going, remember how hot and dry it was? It was so dusty out there. And then I think I came back on again in August. So the monsoons had kind of come, it had rained, and what the rain had done was just melt or, got rid of some of that light dust, and it started exposing artifacts. I think archaeologists are finding like arrowheads every day in some of these lines that we had already walked. So this one was found in that way. And it included just a bunch of flakes. We also found some more micaceous ceramics, a little bit different. We found some projectile points, and we found this, I didn't find it, but someone found this really cool, he thinks it was an awl, like a bone awl, and it's actually made from a elk ulna. That was kind of a cool find. It was found in some of the push piles from the dozers. So what we did for this site was we just really did the documentation. We noted all of the places. So the part where we're sitting at here was undisturbed, luckily. So we could document everything in there, but some of the lines, really just taking photographs of what happened and writing all of that up, and then working with some of the crews on how to minimize some of that further damage as they came in for repair. And this site was eventually rehabbed later on using a hand crew, and some of the artifacts were reburied. But this was kind of a mess of roads too, and so one of the big concerns in this area was having some of that unauthorized use of these roads. People on UTVs or vehicles on roads that were not previously drivable are now very drivable, and so they worked to just kind of put up some of these logs to cover it up, so it looks like this, so to prevent kind of erosion and there. And that's it.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, does your documentation enable artifact hunters to locate these sites and go out and, do their hunting? The second question is, very roughly, because you're not an economist, and I am, well, what percentage of the overall cost of the wildfire treatment of, whatever, would you say the archaeology budget represents?
Well, we're very expensive.
Yeah, I imagine it.
I wouldn't say not. It's
Would
probably.
you say 1%?
Yeah, like not. And when you talk about the fire costing, no. A lot of that goes more towards the heavy equipment and feeding people.
Right.
And a lot of the suppression experts.
Right.
Not so much us. The treatment.
What about the first question?
The first question is, we do, even on regular, our regular job, that information is not public information. And so when we actually have to work with two different kind of programs when we're out there doing some of this work, and we'll have one that goes to the fire personnel. There's a spatial program that we use called, it's Field Maps now, and then that one is for the whole fire, like everyone can see, but we don't put any postal sites in that. We have to collect all that on a program called the FENSA, and that data is specifically for archaeologists and for the agency. So we do the best we can do. I mean, we flag everything, and there's that communication. People obviously know there are sites there, but since that flagging is also, they just know it's a sensitive resource. But that could be like a plant It could be, a threatened endangered species, it could be a bird nest, so they don't necessarily know that it's. But I mean, one of the things I love about being on the fire is that I feel like I have a sense of authority that I don't have in my day-to-day job, and so everyone is really respectful of the resource advisors. They kind of, in a way, you kind of run the show, because there's those legal responsibilities that they have. Yeah.
Kathy, you mentioned a lot about the name of the American travel system. And this applies maybe more to our local area than other places, but we also have a very deep project of expanding. To here, it's going to know a lot of what's out there. What you guys do in terms of working with, I'm sure it's not a structure.
And it's not, and this is something that we kind of have an issue with in terms of the section 106 process in general, because there are legal responsibilities for consultation with tribes that some of those other traditional use communities don't have. But that doesn't mean that they can't. They should absolutely participate in the 106 process. I mean, if people have, I don't know how we get that information, to be honest. I know that we work with some people for a safety and protection. Some of that stuff. But they just, I mean, one of the big things about working with the tribe is the executive orders.
Anything in life, making this more
I would like to invite them to participate in 106 process because it is open to the public. We can, the public can be consulting parties in that in a different way, but they kind of have to, I think, be an organization. Like, so there are the estate organizations, and we do work with them a lot in terms of meetings and for our regular projects. But I'll be honest with you, on the fire, I don't, so there is a very structured chain of command. And as resource advisors, we're this really, even though we have that authority, you know, but we have to work through the chain of command. And so a lot of that consultation or working with some of those people happens at a level beyond me. It's usually done like some of the agencies, they have agency administrators that are the ones who are trying to grow.
So do you, point provenience, the artifacts in the site on the surface, like draw a map with the point provenience
If
or?
there's time. So
Okay,
sometimes there's not enough.
yeah, and the things you find, do you leave them lie or you rebury them?
I do not rebury things because that messes with the.
True,
You push it down, now all the stitches.
it's not where it was.
You know what I mean? So,
That's a good point.
no, I leave it there, and
Okay, hope for the best.
if someone wants to come by and pick it up, then that's that juju for them. But yeah, we do, I mean, depending on the site and the time it's allowed, and even in, you know, yeah, I'll go through and.
And
like, I think
that's-
the Ripley Point site is.
And that's really national forest protocol, that you don't rebury, even push it below the surface.
I'm sure there's plenty of archaeologists out there who do that.
Who do it? Yeah, I think so too.
I've worked with some contractors. who do that.
Yeah.
It was actually kind of funny because then they forgot if someone lost the camera. So they needed to go out and retake some photos. I take pictures always on my phone.
And they couldn't find it.
And they couldn't find the camera. I was like, I can't find the artifacts. Could you push it back? But no, I think that, I mean, when you're talking about stratigraphy and where artifacts lie,
Right.
like, even just pushing it a few centimeters.
Changes provenience.
Because what if there is something else there and then now it's associated and.
Yeah, I one time found a really cool sort of half a basin matata that was broken in several pieces, but I had a big half. And it's like the only one I've ever seen that looked like it actually wore out, you know, it's down to about a centimeter thick or less at the bottom, and it had like a couple concentric breaks and you know, I just thought, geez, I don't want to just leave this lying here. So I just kicked sand over it. And I told a Carson archaeologist about that years ago. And he was like, you know, and he said, well, you know, to tell you the truth, I do that myself once in a while. You're really not supposed to. Well, I didn't do a very good job because it was gone the next time I went out.
I mean, there was,
Yeah.
I have, and I mean, to be honest, there was, I don't push things into the ground, but, I think on that Ripley Point site, I point convenience to everything. And there was, one of the projectile points that was found right in that dozer berm. And so I knew that as they're gonna come back through for the repair stuff, that berm is gonna get, so even the hand crew will come in and kind of level those berms out. So I just placed it to a tree nearby, but I wrote it down, right? So like anyone who has those notes is gonna know this projectile point was moved 1 meter west underneath the tree. From where it was located. We did have an archaeologist on fire who was constantly sending me photos, more high altitude data for you. And then when I went back out to try to find them, he moved them. And so, and I didn't know where they were. He didn't say where they were. I just said that he moved them away. It's kind of frustrating. I think you're gonna do it. Like anything in archaeology is documented. Keep track of it. So did you have a question?
Yeah, that Hickory site
Mhm.
that you found, where generally is it? You said normally you don't find Hickory sites that far east or what is it?
It is around
The what?
the Pot Creek area,
Oh, Pot Creek.
not in Pot Creek, but higher. It's a higher elevation too. I mean, I think it's like a lot of these sites, it's kind of cool because I don't think we'd normally be doing work up there and, so yeah, we were able to find something. And then I don't know what Kim thinks, off 518, east of 518.
I have a third question.
Mhm.
During a wildfire, I assume that federal authority overrides all private property. But does it also override all tribal property?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, so that if the fire manager says, we're gonna send our dozers up here, and the tribal chief says, no, you're not. I mean, what is this, what's the status there? What's the authority with respect to tribal? With private property, I understand.
Yeah.
Completely overrides.
That is a good question. I actually thought about that. I think to some extent it still applies because it's like the life of the property. You know, you can't just let the puzzle burn, you know what I mean? So they're, I mean, and actually are very supportive of some of this stuff and they're willing to work, and that's why that communication is so important to have with everybody. But I know that I think there was someone, who mentioned how even some of the tribes are like, can you just put like the fire retardant on our houses? Like, let's just stop it. But I don't think that if they didn't want it, I honestly don't know what that might be. In terms of legal. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Cassandra. That was great. So, we'll see you, August 6th for the potluck. And that house, Stan and Christian Rivelis is out in Dos Montes. But there'll be a map, coming to your emails for that on August 6th, and then August 7th, Poles will be here, talk about the Greece. So have a good summer, everybody. Great, thank you. Enjoy the weather. Yeah. Good.
Speaking and droning to get up.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it asked. Yeah, I had.